The paramedic looked at me once, then looked away. Not because my injuries were minor, because he thought I was already dead. I couldn't blame him. Half my face was covered in blood. The windshield had shattered, the steering wheel was bent, and my left leg was trapped beneath twisted metal. Rain poured through what was left of the driver's side window. Somewhere nearby, a car alarm screamed endlessly. Then I heard my son's voice. "Is she okay?" Not "Dad, are you alive?" Not "Get him out first." Not even "Someone help him." His first words were, "Is she okay?" I tried to turn my head. Pain exploded through my neck. 20 feet away, my son, Gavin, was kneeling beside his wife, Sierra. She was sitting on the curb, crying, holding her wrist. No blood, no broken bones, no visible injuries, just crying. Meanwhile, the firefighters were cutting my truck apart to reach me. An officer walked over to Gavin. "Sir, we need a statement." Gavin pointed towards Sierra. "My wife has an appointment in 40 minutes. The officer blinked. "What? A wellness appointment? A medical appointment?" "No, a spa appointment." For several seconds, nobody spoke. The officer actually thought he misheard. I wish he had. Sierra grabbed Gavin's arm. "We can't miss it. It's prepaid." He nodded. "I know." Then he pointed toward me. "My dad has insurance." The officer stared at him. "So? They'll take care of him." I remember that sentence perfectly. Not because it hurt, because it was the moment I realized something. My son wasn't overwhelmed. He wasn't in shock. He wasn't confused. He had made a choice. And I wasn't it. 3 hours later, I woke up in surgery, 5 broken ribs, crushed knee, clogged lung, internal bleeding. The doctors worked for nearly 7 hours. When I finally opened my eyes again, the room was dark. A nurse sat beside my bed. She smiled. "Welcome back." I tried to speak, nothing came out. She handed me water, then quietly said something strange. "You have a visitor." I assumed she meant Gavin, despite everything. Part of me still hoped. Instead, a woman I'd never seen before stood near the window, early 40s, dark hair, business suit, holding a leather folder. "You don't know me?" I nodded weakly. "I'm Lydia Mercer." "Who?" Her expression softened. "I work for Mercer Logistics." The name sounded familiar. Then I remembered, 22 years earlier, I had worked there briefly, before starting my own trucking company. Lydia smiled. "My father asked me to find you." I frowned. "Why?" She opened the folder, removed an old photograph. The image was faded, 2 men standing beside a delivery truck. One was me, the other was her father, Frank Mercer, my old boss, a man I hadn't spoken to in 2 decades. Then Lydia said something that made me forget every broken bone in my body. 3 months ago, my father updated his will. I closed my eyes. Not another will story, not another inheritance. I didn't have the strength. Apparently Lydia could read my face, because she immediately laughed. "No, this isn't about money." "Good, because I don't want any. You misunderstand." She leaned forward. "My father didn't leave you money. He left you control." That got my attention. Control of what? Lydia answered before I could ask. "Mercer Logistics." I stared at her. Mercer Logistics wasn't a small trucking company anymore. It was one of the largest freight contractors in 3 states. Thousands of employees, hundreds of trucks, massive distribution contracts. And somehow, Frank Mercer had left control of all major vendor approvals to me. I thought the pain medication was making me hallucinate. Until Lydia handed me the paperwork, everything was real. Then she said the part that changed everything. "The first vendor review meeting is next Thursday." I frowned. "So?" She opened another folder. A company logo sat on top. I recognized it instantly because my son talked about it constantly. Gavin and Sierra Premium Transport. Lydia met my eyes. "They're applying for the largest hauling contract in company history." The hospital room became very quiet because somewhere across town, my son still believed he'd left an old man bleeding beside a wrecked truck. What he didn't know was that in 8 days, he'd be standing across a conference table asking that same old man for the contract his entire business desperately needed. 8 days later, I walked into Mercer Logistics using a cane. The doctors hated the idea. The physical therapist hated it even more. But I wasn't missing the meeting. Not because of Gavin, because I wanted answers. For 22 years, I'd wondered why Frank Mercer never called after I left his company. Now I knew. He had hundreds of times. I just never received the messages. Lydia showed me the records, voicemails, letters, holiday cards, even invitations. Somehow, every one of them disappeared before reaching me. Frank had spent years believing I wanted nothing to do with him. I spent years believing he'd forgotten I existed. Both of us had been wrong. And now Frank was gone. A misunderstanding had stolen 2 decades. I wasn't interested in wasting another day. The boardroom doors opened. 6 transport companies entered, one by one, owners, executives, managers. Then Gavin walked in and froze. For a moment, he genuinely looked happy. "Dad?" He rushed forward, then stopped because I didn't stand. I didn't smile. I didn't open my arms. I simply looked at him the same way a stranger might. His expression changed immediately. "You didn't tell me you were here. You never asked where I was." The words landed harder than I expected. He swallowed. "I visited the hospital once. I was busy, I know." The room became uncomfortable fast. Then Sierra entered. Perfect hair, perfect makeup, Dottie Da's suit, not a trace of guilt. She glanced at me, then looked away, as though I were an awkward topic nobody wanted to discuss. That told me everything. Gavin had told her nothing. Or worse, he'd told her everything and she didn't care. The presentations began, one company after another. Routes, costs, equipment, performance history, everything professional, everything normal, until Gavin's turn. He stood confidently, the same confidence I'd spent years helping him build, the same confidence I'd once been proud of. His presentation was excellent, actually excellent. By the end, several executives were nodding. Lydia looked impressed. The operations director looked impressed. Even I was impressed. Then the questions started. A board member asked, "If awarded this contract, what guarantees can you offer regarding emergency response reliability?" Simple question, normal question. Then something unexpected happened. I spoke, for the first time all morning. "Gavin," he looked toward me. "Suppose one of your drivers is involved in a major accident." The room went quiet. He didn't know where this was going. "Okay," I nodded. "Suppose that injured driver needs immediate support." He shifted uneasily. "Of course we'd respond." "How quickly?" "As quickly as possible." "Immediately?" "Yes, even if someone else had personal plans." His face changed slightly, not enough for others to notice, enough for me. I continued. "Because reliability isn't tested when things are easy. It's tested when helping someone costs you something." Nobody moved, nobody spoke. The boardroom had become very still. Gavin knew exactly what I was talking about, and for the first time since the crash, so did he. The presentation ended shortly afterward. No public humiliation, no dramatic confrontation. Just silence, the kind that follows when someone realizes they can no longer hide from themselves. At lunch, I stepped outside onto the company terrace. The city stretched below. Wind pushed against my jacket. A few minutes later, I heard footsteps. Gavin, of course. He stood beside me, not speaking, not apologizing, just standing. Finally, he said, "I didn't think you'd survive." I turned slowly. "What?" His eyes filled with something I hadn't seen in years, shame. "When they pulled me away from the crash, the firefighter said it looked bad. I convinced myself there wasn't anything I could do." The wind carried his words away, but not before I heard them. Then he said something worse, the truth. "I chose the easier person." I frowned. "What?" He looked toward the skyline. "Sierra was crying. You weren't. She needed attention. You needed help. I chose attention." The honesty surprised me, because excuses would have been easier. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then I asked, "Do you know what hurt most?" He shook his head. "The crash? No. The hospital? No. The surgery? No." I looked directly at him. The fact that every nurse on my floor knew my son didn't stay. His face drained of color before he could answer. Lydia stepped onto the terrace. Her expression was serious. "Gavin," he turned. "The board has finished reviewing all 6 proposals." His eyes widened. "Already?" She nodded, then added, "There was a problem uncovered during the review." The atmosphere changed instantly. "What kind of problem?" Lydia handed him a folder. He opened it, started reading, and suddenly looked sick, because buried inside the application was something he clearly had never seen before. A series of invoices, signed approvals, vendor payments, transfers, everyone authorized by a single person. Not Gavin, not the company accountant, not the operations manager, Sierra. And the numbers attached to those signatures were large enough to destroy everything they'd spent 10 years building. For the second time in 2 weeks, my son discovered that the person he'd trusted most had been making decisions behind his back. Gavin stared at the invoices once, twice, then a third time, as though the numbers might change if he looked long enough. They didn't. The total sat at the bottom of the page, $3.8 million. Missing, moved, reclassified, high through dozens of transactions. His voice barely worked. "What is this?" Lydia answered calmly. "Payments routed through shell vendors, approved by Sierra." "No, that's impossible. I thought so too." She handed him another folder, then another, then another. The stack kept growing. By the 5th folder, the denial disappeared. By the 10th, the color disappeared from his face. By the 15th, he couldn't sit down fast enough because every page told the same story. Sierra had been quietly draining money from the company for years. Not enough to trigger alarms, not enough to attract auditors. Just enough, over and over again, until millions were gone. I watched my son carefully, not with satisfaction, with disappointment, because I recognized the expression. It was the same one he'd worn at the accident scene, the expression of a man realizing reality isn't what he wanted it to be. "Did you know?" Gavin finally asked me. "No, not until yesterday." He lowered his head. "I never checked." Lydia nodded. "That's obvious." The bluntness hit hard, but she wasn't finished. "You signed whatever Sierra placed in front of you. You skipped compliance reviews. You missed 3 audit requests. You ignored 2 financial warnings." Gavin stared at the table. Every sentence landed like a hammer. Then Lydia said something nobody expected. "The missing money isn't the biggest problem." Gavin looked up. What could possibly be worse? She slid one final document across the table, a contract signed 6 months earlier, Sierra's signature, a foreign logistics broker. Large penalties, personal guarantees. Gavin began reading. Halfway through, his hands started shaking because Sierra hadn't only stolen money. She had secretly pledged company assets as collateral, assets the company didn't actually own. The room became silent. Then Gavin whispered, "We're bankrupt." Lydia didn't answer. She didn't need to. That evening, Gavin drove home for the first time in years. Not in his luxury SUV. He barely remembered the drive. The world felt distant, muted, unreal. The house was brightly lit. Music played inside. Lotta, guests, a party. He opened the door and froze. Sierra was hosting a celebration, champagne catering, live musicians, nearly 40 people. Someone shouted, "Future contract winners." The crowd cheered. Sierra raised her glass, then noticed Gavin. Her smile vanished. Immediately, the room sensed something was wrong. Conversation died. Music stopped. Every eye turned. Gavin walked forward slowly. No yelling, no dramatic scene, no rage. Just silence, the dangerous kind. "Sierra." She forced a smile. "You're home early." He placed the folders on the dining table, the same table where they'd celebrated anniversaries, birthdays, successes, everything. The folders landed with a heavy thud. She looked at them, then looked away, too quickly. And that told him everything. "What are those? You tell me." She didn't answer. A guest quietly slipped toward the door, then another, then another. Within 2 minutes, half the room was gone. Nobody wanted to be near whatever was happening. Gavin opened the top folder. Read the first invoice aloud, then the second, then the third. Each one signed by Sierra. Each one impossible to explain away. The room grew smaller with every page. Finally, she stopped pretending. Her shoulders dropped, and she laughed. Actually laughed, not happily, bitterly, exhaustedly, like someone tired of carrying a lie. "You want the truth?" Nobody answered. She continued anyway. "I was tired. Tired of pretending we were rich. We weren't." Gavin stared. "We owned 3 homes, 2 yachts, a private membership club." She shook her head. "Exactly. Everything was borrowed. Everything depended on the next contract, the next deal, the next year." She pointed at him. "You loved looking successful. You just didn't care how expensive it was." The words hit harder than the fraud, because part of them were true. Then she delivered the final blow. "I thought that Mercer contract would save everything." The room went completely silent, because now everyone understood. The spa appointment, the accident, the money, the pressure, the lies. Everything had been building toward one desperate gamble. Gavin looked around the room, at the guests, at the champagne, at the decorations, at the life he'd spent years building. Then he quietly said, "Get out." Nobody moved. He repeated it, louder. Everyone out. Within minutes, the mansion was empty, except for two people, a husband and a wife. Neither recognized the other anymore. At nearly midnight, my phone rang. Gavin. I considered letting it ring. Instead, I answered. For several seconds, I heard nothing, then his voice cracked for the first time since he was a child. "Dad." Another pause, a long one. Then, "I think I ruined my life." I looked out the hospital window. The city lights stretched into the distance. And for the first time since the crash, I finally had an answer ready for him. But whether I would help him was a decision I still hadn't made. I didn't answer immediately. Not because I wanted revenge, because for the first time in his life, Gavin was sitting alone with the consequences of his choices, and some lessons become worthless if they're interrupted too soon. "Dad, you still there?" "Yes." "I don't know what to do." I looked out across the hospital parking lot. Ambulances came and went. Nurses changed shifts. Life kept moving, no matter how badly someone wanted time to stop. Finally, I asked, "Do you remember the accident?" His breathing changed. "Every day." "Good." Because I wanted him to remember, not the crash, the choice. "When they loaded me into the ambulance, I was convinced I'd never see you again." Silence. "You looked at me once," I continued. "Then you turned around and left." His voice cracked. "Dad." "I know. No, you don't." The room became very quiet, because this wasn't about business anymore, or Sierra, or money. "I wasn't afraid of dying," I said. "I was afraid my final memory of my son would be him deciding I wasn't important enough to stay for." The line went silent, completely silent. Then I heard him crying, not loud, not dramatic, the kind of crying grown men do when nobody is watching. The next morning, I checked myself out of the hospital against medical advice. The doctors hated it, the nurses argued. I left anyway, because there was something I needed to do. 2 days later, Mercer Logistics held its final contract vote. Every transport company returned, including Gavin's, or what was left of it. He looked different, not because of the scandal, because the arrogance was gone. The expensive confidence, the certainty, the excuses. Gone. The board reviewed every proposal, every financial statement, every risk assessment. Then the chairman stood. "We have reached a decision." The room froze. The Mercer National Freight contract will not be awarded to Gavin and Sierra Premium Transport. Nobody looked surprised, not even Gavin. He already knew, the chairman continued. However, several heads lifted. "We have unanimously voted to create a new regional carrier partnership." Murmurs spread through the room. Nobody understood, until the chairman explained. Rather than one giant contract, Mercer would divide operations among smaller independent carriers, companies with proven safety records, honest books, reliable drivers, community reputations. Then he looked directly at Gavin. "Your company no longer qualifies." The words landed like concrete, final, permanent. Years earlier, that announcement would have destroyed him, but this time, he simply nodded because he knew they were right. The meeting ended. People filed out. Lydia gathered her papers. The board left. Eventually, only 2 people remained. Me and Gavin. He stood near the conference table, looking at the empty chairs, the empty room, the opportunity he'd lost. Then he surprised me. He didn't ask for money. He didn't ask for help. He didn't ask me to save him. Instead, he said, "I deserve this." I studied him carefully because those 3 words were the first truly adult thing I'd heard from him in years. A week later, the divorce became public. The fraud investigation became public. The company collapsed. Most people expected me to celebrate. I didn't. There was nothing joyful about watching a family fall apart, even when they helped cause it. 3 months later, I drove past a construction site on the edge of town and saw someone carrying lumber, sweating, working, learning. Gavin. No executive office, no luxury suit, no assistant, no company car, just a hard hat, steel-toe boots, and honest work. He saw my truck, walked over, wiped dust from his face. Neither of us spoke for a moment, then he smiled. A small one, the kind I remembered from years ago, before success became his entire personality. I sold the house. He said. I nodded. The boats too. I nodded again. The last thing left is paying everyone back. For the first time, I felt proud of him, not because he was succeeding, because he had stopped running. A few weeks later, he invited me to dinner. Nothing fancy, a tiny roadside diner, plastic menus, sticky tables, bad coffee. Halfway through the meal, he reached into his wallet, pulled out a folded receipt, and slid it across the table. I looked down, confused. Hospital charges, rehabilitation expenses, medication costs, transportation bills, every dollar connected to the accident, paid in full. I looked up. He shrugged. You shouldn't have had to carry that. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then I finally asked the question I'd been carrying for months. Why did you really call me that night? His eyes lowered. Because when everything collapsed, I realized something. What? He swallowed. The person I abandoned in a wrecked truck was the only person I still trusted. And in that moment, I realized revenge had never been the victory. The real victory was watching a man who once chose convenience over character finally become someone worth respecting again.